Hi, everybody. This is a little bit of a different episode. We're going to talk about daylilies today, but it's also a recording that I did for the Hardin County Library. So you might see the same video on their site too. I hope you enjoy. I hope you learn a little bit about daylilies, the perfect perennial. I'll talk to you later. Have a good day and happy gardening. Why is it called a daylily? Well, basically, they were not very creative when they named them, so it's called daylily because the flowers are there just for one day. And the reason we get more bloom time out of them is that there's multiple buds, as you can see on here. Oops, as I just advanced the slide. So as you can see, there's multiple buds, and you just pick off the old blooms, and they stay pretty clean, and they will eventually, if you're really worried about it, you can pick them off every day, but eventually they'll dry up and fall off. So you don't have to go out and deadhead like you normally would if you don't want to. So once they only last a day, but there's multiple buds on there, which is good because then we get 2 or 3 weeks of flowers out of our perennials, which is really what we want and what we're looking for. So scientifically, the scientific name is hemerocallis. It's the Greek for hemera means day and callus means beauty, so it's beautiful for a day. It was originally put in the lily family, but taxonomists decided that it wasn't really a lily, and so they're now their own family, which is kind of funny. So if you look at some older books and things, you might see them listed as lily in the lily family as opposed to hemerocallis. The ancient Chinese used the plants, roots, the leaves, and the flowers for food. So they are edible. They might not taste like much. They used its roots and crown as a pain reliever, and for other medical purposes. But we really don't recommend you just go out and chomp on some daylilies. Let's see. And really what you see, you might see them split into 2 words as day and lily, but really it was combined as one word because it's not a true lily. The true lilies are the real big oriental lilies that have their big flowers at the top on a big thick stem. So that's why you'll see daylily split into, or is back into one word, because it's not a true lily. Why is it the perfect perennial? Because that's what we had, touted this is the perfect one. There's lots of colors. They come in all colors of the rainbow. I do not think yet that there is a blue daylily, but they have all the colors ranging from yellows, reds, oranges. There's some deep, dark purpley colors that shift to the red side, but there's over 80,000 varieties, 80,000 varieties. They're pretty easy to grow. They survive with very little care, hence the reason we call these ditch lilies here in Kentucky. We call them tiger lilies where I'm from, but they grow pretty much anywhere. And they're pretty suitable all the way from Minnesota all the way down into like mid-Florida. So they really do run the gamut of all the zones. And they have a pretty good long season of bloom. Like I said, they're about 3, sometimes 4 weeks. And now there's even more rebloomers. So you'll get 3 to 4 weeks of blooms in the spring or summer, like June and July is when they're mostly blooming. And then you might have another spurt in August, September, sometimes in October, because they'll sit there and they'll rebloom. So where did they come from? Well, we think they're original to Kentucky, but they're not. They're an introduced species. They're native to Asia. And if you look at where Asia, you all know where Asia is, and they were hybridized since the 30s in the United States. So humans have gotten in there and mucked up the genetics. It started with a yellow, an orange, and kind of a rusty red, but there's not a true white, although they're getting close, and a true blue. So we like our ditch lilies. We love ours. They're yellow or orange, and usually they're scented. I didn't know if you knew that most daylilies have a scent. And then all the modern hybridizing has come from this orange daylily. So it has a lot of colors in its genetics. And if you see a bunch of these listed in a field, you might see some that are a little bit lighter yellow, some of them are a little darker orange, and that's where it kind of comes out in their origin story. So the breeders got in there and they started selecting what they liked. if you go to daylily catalogs, there's lots of descriptions. So you might see something that's clump forming. That means that it's not going to run and spread like Bermuda grass. It's going to pretty much stay in its little spot that you put it. It's herbaceous. It means that the leaves usually die down in the wintertime. There are some that are evergreen, so you have to kind of watch. Here in central Kentucky, the evergreen ones will do just fine. They'll kind of burn off in the wintertime, but they may still stay green, totally fine. And then there's some that will just not be, some will be semi-evergreen, that they'll lose a lot of their leaves, and then a lot of them will just die back to the ground. It's perennial, so it's supposed to come back every year. Sometimes they don't. It's, it's kind of like, why do one person live longer than the other? And they have a fibrous or a tuberous root system. So they have a fairly fleshy root, and I'll show that in the next slide. And we'll kind of go through the growing parts. So here's the parts of the plant. We have the roots. You see they're kind of fleshy. When you dig up your daylilies to overwinter, you want to make sure that they have these really thick, fleshy roots, because that's where your energy is for those blooms to come up in the next summer. Here's the crown. The crown is really important. That's where it should be planted. You can see the planting depth is just maybe a ½ an inch deeper than the crown, and that protects your growing point. So the crown is your growing point, and you can see in this picture, can you all see my mouse when I move it over? Okay. So you see here's a little bud. So this stalk is going to put out another little stalk to the next. So you'll have a little baby plant in a couple of years that you can cut off and then transplant to somewhere else. So here's your crown, and then your planting depth is just a little bit deeper than the crown. They have a pretty good center midrib, and then they flatten into what they call a fan. And then multiple fans of a single plant can form a clump. So usually when you're digging up your daylilies to divide them, you have this clump. And then you can find in there where you can take off 2 or 3 little fans. Although I will say, if you buy daylilies from a breeder, or if you buy some from a mail order company, you will get like 1 little fan. So remember that when you look at the price. So if it's like $50 or $60, you might only get 1 fan. So that's a little high. That's a little high for daylilies. But if you're a breeder, or if you're a connoisseur, paying $50 or $100 or $150 for daylilies is not unheard of. I can usually find something that's pretty comparable, but the newer varieties are going to be more expensive. But with this clump, you can divide that probably into 4 or 5 clumps and spread them out over your garden.
Okay, well, Deanna was wondering what's the best time of year to split them for spreading out, and what do you mean by digging up for overwintering?
Oh, did I say digging up for overwintering? You don't have to dig them up for overwintering. So that's a correction. But you can divide them in the spring, and you can divide them in the fall. If you divide them during the summertime, the soil's really hard to put a shovel in, and then you would have to continue to water it over the hot, dry summertime. So usually spring and fall. And when I say spring, it's as early as March or April. And fall, you can probably divide these up until about mid-October. You don't want to go past mid-October, because you want that root system to continue to grow in the soil while it's still warm. And our soils here don't usually freeze until about mid to late November. So that'll make sure that it doesn't heave out of the ground over the course of the winter as that soil freezes and thaws. And really, there's a lot of places around here that are selling them off of their farm. So if you have one that's blooming and you drive by and they've got rows and rows of daylilies, stop in and see if they'll dig you up a spot, a clump. Usually you can get some pretty neat daylily colors just locally. I know we have a couple of local breeders. Kenny Shively is another local breeder. And then there's another one, Martin Glickman is another local breeder. Yes, Dina, a good planting place would be to put them in the culvert. That's hard to mow because it looks like grass. It gets a little taller, but you don't have to weed eat that, but maybe once a year in the fall when those leaves die back. Awesome. And I think that's why people throw them in the ditch. But some other things you might see, we call the flower stalk escape, not escape, escape. And that's kind of where all the buds are. This one's looking like it's about, halfway done. And then sometimes, and it depends on the variety, you'll get what they call a proliferation, which is basically on the scape, but it's a little baby plant. And what happens is you'll see it on the scape and you'll go, oh. And then you can, once you get a little bit of roots on there, and they look like they're aerial roots like an orchid, you can cut, when that scape kind of dies back, you can take that proliferation and pot it, and you'll have a new baby plant, which is an exact same copy of the one that you had. So it's not been, the genetics are the same for the proliferations. It's like dividing your plant. When you divide something that's asexual propagated, you have a clonal copy. Whereas if you were to plant the daylily seeds, which hybridizers do, then you get all the genetics all mixed up with that. So here's the whole plant. This is kind of what it looks like. I kind of borrowed that from the Daylily organization. They are the ones, daylilies.org is the Hemerocallis Society, and they have all 80,000 hybrid named varieties listed. So if you're looking for a specific variety, you can find it to see if it's listed. And I think they have photographs for most of them for that. So again, how do you propagate? You can multiply from the fan. Sometimes you just need one little fan there. And then over the course of 2 or 3 years, it'll grow and get pretty clumpy. I talked about the proliferations. And then to go on, you can hybridize. And this is pretty easy to do. You can just take the seeds that you have and put them on the ground. I would probably put them in a container so that you can kind of watch them, because daylily sprouts are about 3 inches tall that first year from seed. It will take them a little longer to grow from seed, but you can see what you get if you've got a lot of different daylilies around, because they're pollinated by bees. They're not identical to the plant, but the proliferations and the fans are. So if you want to give a friend some daylilies, you can just cut up the clump. So we talked about foliage. So there's different foliage types. They do need a dormancy period. So that's just where they just kind of go dormant and they look awful. But I suggest not pulling up those leaves, because that actually protects the crown a little bit. It gives it a little bit of insulation. If you get one that's like designated dormant, they lose their foliage completely after frost. And then they overwinter with just the pointed buds. And you can see these little pointed buds out here. So be really careful when you quote unquote clean this up, because you may damage some of the buds. And if it gets really cold, which we're kind of due for, it may damage those buds, and that you may not get flowers the next spring. So this is what semi-evergreen looks like. Kind of looks like it's starting to grow, but not quite. And that's just kind of the in-between dormant and evergreen. And then here's evergreen. So you should have, in an evergreen daylily, you should have foliage throughout the winter. It'll be a mound of frozen pale green foliage. And if it gets warm over the winter, it may start to grow during mild climates. So if we get kind of a warm winter, but the evergreen daylilies don't set resting buds. So as you saw earlier just previously with these little resting buds, the evergreen ones don't do that. So here's a garden with all the foliage types. So you can see the evergreens, the semi-evergreens, and then the ones that are totally, not evergreen at all. So cold hardiness. They're quite variable depending on the variety. Some are ironclad hardy, some are extremely tender. So if you're thinking about putting one from Florida in your garden, you might be careful, because it may not be fully hardy here. And it just depends. So this is what frost damage looks like on daylilies on something that wasn't totally cold hardy. If we remember we got that freeze in May, nothing was ready for that. So you'll get brown spots. It'll look kind of wet and kind of soaked for that. So again, if you mail order, just make sure that variety is rated for your zone. And we're zone 6B, I think. well, I know it's 6B, but that way you can make sure that you don't get something that's cold hardy to only 7 or 8. Some of the evergreen ones from Florida are not very cold hardy for here. Ooh, genetics. They really have messed up the genetics of daylilies, because in humans, we have diploid, so we have two alleles for every gene. In daylilies, they've kind of messed around with the genetics, and they actually have 4. They're tetraploid or they're triploid. Usually the triploid, and it'll say in the description if you go on daylilies.org that this is a triploid or a tetraploid daylily. The triploids are usually sterile, but they've used chemical means to get them to be triploid, and there's reasons why they've done that. But then tetraploid has like 2 whole sets of genetic information, so it has 4 instead of our normal 2. Why do they do this? Well, because they can, and you get larger flowers, you get more intense colors, especially if you have 4 chromosomes, which is in daylilies is 44 chromosomes. Their colors tend to be more intense, so they're not as pale. They have stronger stems, and their flowers tend to be heavier, so they've got a thicker foliage, and you have more possibility, more diversity in your seeds when you start to lay those out. And this one happens to be, I knew the name of this one. This one's Strawberry Candy. And can you see there's this pickety edge, there's this little round, and that petal looks like thick and I would say juicy, but it's like meaty. That's what you get with a tetraploid daylily. So if you go to like the Arboretum at the Pritchard Center or in somebody else's daylily beds, you can kind of pick out the ones that are tetraploid, because daylilies on steroids. They're just beefy. And you get all this variety just from a tetraploid daylily. You get this little ruffly edge, those dark colors. I think they call this flaming, but we'll talk about that too. So here's some more. Here's diploids. So you can see that they're kind of a little spindlier. They may be a little paler for that. So diploid has the basic 22 chromosomes that a daylily should have. And the diploids are really good at cross-pollinating. You get more spiders, which is what this Dances with Giraffes is, which I think is hilarious. Double daylilies. I don't think there's a picture of a double in here. Nope. Where you have double the number of petals. And diploids are easier to cross. And there are more diploid lines than there are tetraploid lines, because you have to mess with some really nasty chemicals to get tetraploids. So there's blooming sequence. So if you're looking at a catalog and you're like, oh, I want daylilies for, the whole season that I can extra have. So you're looking at extra early to very late. So late June to early July is our peak. So I would say that would be our mid-season for us. So if you're looking for the ultimate in daylily beds, that's early. I would say extra early would be probably early May, and then you can go very late into October, November for that. The Hemerocallis Society publishes an annual source list, which I would definitely look at. Their societies, the Louisville Daylily Society usually comes to the plant fair, which we canceled this year, but you could probably contact them, and they have a bunch that they dig out of societies and auctions. Friends, sometimes if I do a Gardener's Toolbox class, we have giveaways for that. So how much do they cost? Well, they're $3 to $500. This one, I think, I'm not sure what this one is, but it was very expensive when I looked it up, and I think it was $500. Usually that's when you get one little scape, and it's a little tiny plant, and you hope that it lives because you spent so much money on it. Don't be scared off by daylilies because of the price. You can get some really good ones. Even the rebloomers are $3 to $10. Only the most expensive ones are the newest ones are really expensive. Are we north or are we south? That's the question. We're right in the zombie zone between the two. Up north, they plant them in the spring because they have such a long winter. But in the south, we can do early spring or late fall. So like I said, you can do either one here. But if you plant them like now in July, you're going to have to water them. And then you could overwater them and cause them to rot. So usually I would wait until about September to start planting those again. And usually the fall plants do pretty well, and that you can get them for less expense because the garden centers want to get them out of their nurseries for that. We didn't talk about where to plant them. They prefer sun, but they'll do okay in shade. They need a minimum of 6 hours of sun, direct sun. And really, the more pastel-y the shades, the more sun they need to bring out their colors. The reds, the purples benefit from partial shade in the heat of the day because the dark colors absorb heat and they don't look as well as the lighter colors do towards the end of the day. But you plant out in the middle of the sun. A lot of them will be planted in the middle of the yard. We just need well-drained soil. Like you said, in the ditch, they'll tolerate flooding with that. You can add them some compost if you need to kind of loosen your soil up, but they're pretty non-specific. They go well with other things. So if you've got some, cone flowers and things in your garden, you can throw daylilies in there. Okay, so if you order them from a company, you're going to get bare root plants like this, and you're going to go, I paid that much money for this. But once you get them in the spring, you kind of want to. I soak mine for an hour or two just to kind of revive the root system. You can soak the roots for a few hours or overnight in a bucket of water. Pot them into a pot at this stage if you might lose them in your garden. But if you have any kind of dead or broken roots, you want to kind of prune those off, and then you can just plant them out just like this in the early springtime. Kay, can they do well out in pots indoors? There's not enough sun indoors for them to do well, I don't think, for daylilies. But they do well in pots outside. But I just don't think we have enough light in our houses to do all that. So here's how you plant your little fans. Dig a hole so that you can kind of spread those roots out. I would have dug a little bit bigger hole than this person did, but you can see the roots are kind of spread out. And then I would just take that soil and kind of mound that over there. You want to kind of mound your roots, kind of spread them out a little bit. I would have made at least like 3 times bigger because I want to make sure those roots are spread out pretty flat. I don't want them to kind of go down and jay back up out of the hole. And you can see where they were dug up. You can see that little dirt line. That's where I want that, excuse me, the soil to fill back in. Dean asked, if the digging up current plants, is it best to trim the leaves back to a shorter length for splitting and replanting? You don't have to. And my theory is that if you take off leaves, that's less photosynthetic area for that plant to have to replace. Spacing. Some of these plants get pretty big, and usually they'll tell you in the description how wide they're going to get. So make sure that you at least give them 18 to 24 inches. Otherwise, they're going to fill in, and you're going to have to you're going to have to divide them again if they get too close together. If they get too close together, again, you're going to see fewer flowers on them. And then labeling. We all think that we're going to remember what plants we planted where. So sometimes even just a popsicle stick with a name on it will help. That's always an issue. And if you're going to use like wooden sticks or something with as a marker, which is really easy to do, use pencil. Don't use pen. Don't use like a Sharpie because it fades. A pencil is much easier to read on a wooden stick than it is than anything else. Water, fertilizing, any kind of what you would do in your other gardens. A balanced fertilizer is great, but don't cover the crown. Water, you want to water at least 2 or 3 times a week to establish, but after that, they're pretty good with through our droughts. I will say that they will be fairly drought resistant once they get established that first or second year. So watering in the spring, most important in this, we usually get enough rain in the spring not to have to worry about it. And that helps your buds later on. They like deep watering. So you really need to water if you're going to 8 to 10 inches of the soil. 5 to 6 inches for us is about 1.5 inches of rain. So what I try to do is, if I'm hand watering, it's kind of harder to do, but if you take a pie pan out and it's flat and you can figure out how long it takes to water and fill the pie pan, that's about how much water you need to put on. If you've got a soaker hose, you can stick the pie pan underneath there and turn it on and see how long it takes to fill. Fertilizing. Take a soil sample first. A lot of people over fertilize anyway, and you can just use one application in the spring. If you just need a little bit, just this bone meal will give you some nitrogen. That's good, but it has phosphorus and a little bit of potassium in it. You for that. Although I will say, the organic mulches will add a little bit of nutrients to your soil, which is often all we need to do. And it keeps the weeding down. Yay! Nobody likes to weed. And it retains the moisture, so you don't have to water quite as much. I like organic mulches. It's like hardwood. There's a really good compost mulch that has some horse manure in it. That'll give you a little bit more nutrients. The rock mulches are really hard because the rocks heat up and then they transfer that heat into the soil. So you may find that your daylilies bloom a little earlier than they're supposed to, or they stay active a little later into the season because of that heat transfer from the gravel or the rocks. Other tasks: grooming. You can take your dead blooms off. That's great, but weeding is probably the biggest thing that you want to do there. These are aphids, or plant lice. And they will suck the juice out of your plant, which is you don't want that to happen. But the cool thing is that we have plenty of ladybugs that will eat these little suckers, and you see these usually in the spring and the fall, and they're pretty much ubiquitous. And if you have those and you don't see any ladybugs around there, or lacewings or anything that will eat them, an insecticidal soap will control those fairly easily. That's like the least toxic thing you can do for those. Deer love daylily flowers, blossoms. They'll just eat the buds right off. So as cute as baby Bambi is, sometimes we have to put on a hot pepper spray or something to keep them deterred. And then there's always slugs. Slugs just like the dead foliage. So if you find that you've got long streaks and holes in your foliage, you might want to clean up the dead leaves around the edge, because they'll also feed on the dead. But sometimes the slugs and the snails will feed on your live plants, which is not good. There is a disease. There's a couple of diseases. Rust is one of them. We haven't really seen it here in Kentucky very much, but you'll see the edges of the leaves will turn brown and yellow, and you'll see these orangey kind of pustules come out. The leaves may die back as a whole, but the plant should survive. So if you start to see this in your garden, that is a point where you can just take those leaves out and cut them out. And then spring sickness, it's just a disorder. Sometimes when the foliage is twisty and stunted and discolored, I think that's probably due to it started to grow and then it got cold again. So it's kind of a damaging to the foliage. Leaf streak, again, if you start to see these dead foliage, just cut it out. It can cause dieback a little bit, but not death of the plant. It's pretty cosmetic. This one, on the other hand, is horrible. Crown and root rot. If you have this in your garden, you probably have some really heavy soils. If the crown is mushy and the leaves are just kind of falling out and they look kind of gross, that's pretty much crown and root rot. If you see, you can't see it in the picture, but there might be some mustard seeds that you'll see around the edges of the dead material. That's southern blight, and we can make that diagnosis for you. It may smell bad, and that may be a bacterial infection, or it could be a lot of different things. But it's usually when there's a lot of water at the crown, poor air circulation, and things of that sort. So, and then here's some other resources. I really love their space. Their website does a really good job.